Tashi Delek, everyone. Tashi Delek. Welcome to the panel 3, Why the Third Pole Matters. I'm Lobsang Yangso, the Program and Environment Desk Coordinator of International Tibet Network, and I will be the moderating today's panel. And I welcome also our viewers from online and wonderful people who have come here for this panel. So our panel is titled Why the Third Pole Matters. Tibet holds the third largest ice mass outside the North and the South Pole, and consequently, Tibet is often referred as the third pole, and supplying water to more than 1.4 billion population, which is around 25% of the global population. But right now, third pole is melting, and that the temperature is rising on the Tibetan Plateau 2 to 4 times faster than the global average, so which also affecting the food and water security of the downstream nations. And so Tibet's warming has accelerated glacier and permafrost melting, and also desertification and grassland degradation. Moreover, when we look at the climate change on the Tibetan Plateau and Tibet third pole, Tibet is on the front line of the global climate crisis, and Tibetan Plateau is a very fragile and critically sensitive and also critically ecological, that is extremely sensitive to the climate change. So we will be discussing more on this topic during our panel. And so welcome all my panelists, and we have Professor Roland Senna joining us online from Italy. Welcome, Professor. So before I introduce our panelists, I would like to remind our panelists that for your first presentation, we have 5 minutes each for the presenter, and then we will have 40 minutes for moderated discussion, and then we have almost 45 minutes for the Q&A discussion, people who are present here and also those who are joining us from Zoom. And our participants who are joining through Zoom are requested to kindly put your questions on the chat box, and we will have a discussion on that. So first presenter that we have is Professor Dr. Martin Mill, and he's a senior lecturer in anthropology at the University of Aberdeen, Scotland. And Dr. Martin Mill is also the secretary of the cross-party group on Tibet for the Scottish Parliament. And then in 2019, you had a report saying the climate change on the third pole causes and also processes and consequences.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah. So, and without going much further, I would request Dr. Martin to start your presentation.
Okay, I shall. Can we have the first slide, please? Okay. So first off, I would say I was the secretary of the cross-party group on Tibet until last year when and we completed a 2-year report, a 2-year inquiry summarizing and reviewing all of the kind of up-to-date scientific consensus on the question of the impact of climate change across the Tibetan Plateau, across the surrounding regions. You can see the Tibetan Plateau here, surrounded by its major mountain regions, the Himalayas to the south there, the Tangala to the east. In the west, you have the Pamirs and the Karakoram, to the north, the Tian Shan. This whole region as a whole is called the third pole. It takes up 4.2 million square miles. That is about the size of Western Europe, for those of you who thought that Tibet was a little smaller. That central Tibetan area was created 52 million years ago when the Indian subcontinent crashed into Eurasia and created a huge crumple zone that we call the third pole. Its average altitude is about 4,000 meters. This means that it is warming 2 to 4 times faster than sea level, because the higher up you go in the atmosphere, the faster climate warming occurs. So this principle also applies to the Andes, it applies to the Alps, and it applies to the Sierra Nevada. Okay, all of that principle applies. Now, why is the third pole important? Well, the first reason is that the reason why it's called the third pole. The third pole area as a whole contains the largest quantity of frozen fresh water outside the Arctic and the Antarctic. But, and here's the most important point, it is the only pole, therefore, that is surrounded by half the world's population on its doorstep. That is why it's actually, in a sense, more vital than the other poles, because of its immediate impact on the populations and human communities, industry and agriculture of China, India, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Pakistan, all of those surrounding countries. Okay, so this is a really, really important part because it plays a crucial component in what is called water cycles. Asia's water cycles center on the third pole region. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, that water cycle creates the Tibetan Plateau and the third pole region as a source of Asia's major rivers. The Indus, the Brahmaputra, the Ganges, the Sutlej, the Irrawaddy, the Mekong, the Tarim to the north, the Yangtze, the Yellow, all of these rivers, which supply and act as the basis of almost all human civilization in Asia, come from the third pole region. Okay, that's why they call it the water tower of Asia. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, at the heart of this is the third pole's capacity to regulate that water supply, to regulate its water supply to human communities. And this comes from what we refer to in the scientific literature as the cryosphere. That is the domain of ice, almost a direct translation, oddly, of the word Himalaya, or the Tibetan word Kawachen, the domain of snow and ice. This snow and ice, this frozen fresh water exists in 3 major forms. The first on the bottom there is snow, the second is glaciers, and the third, the hidden element of this, is the underground permafrost. And as you can see from that picture there, when you go down about 1 meter of what's called the active layer, you get to an actual underground iceberg. If the permafrost is old enough, it will have separated out into an underground iceberg and a shield layer. Now, in areas like Siberia, that shield layer, that underground iceberg, is as deep as 1.5 kilometers. In Canada, 747 meters deep. In the Himalayas, we don't entirely know. And this is one of the most important bits. We don't actually have enough scientific data to make completely firm conclusions. And that's a real problem because it is a contested political territory. Okay, and that actually stands in the way of our understanding. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, just to explain for you that have forgotten their secondary school geography, what's a water cycle? Okay, a water cycle is what allows everybody in this room and everybody listening to this to be alive. Human civilization depends upon existing within a water cycle. A water cycle takes salt water from the seas, it evaporates it, it moves it towards mountains, it falls as fresh water with no salt in it, that then flows back down to the sea, all right? Now, in a situation that's very warm, and there is no ice, that will all occur within a matter of days or weeks. It will be a very fast water cycle, and you will get a flood, and the rest of the year you will get a drought. What happens at the moment is that the third pole keeps it, keeps some of it, keeps it as ice. And that ice melts throughout the year, allowing all of those 10 rivers to run continuously. And that's important because you can't put salt water into a human being because they'll break. You can't put salt water onto your fields because nothing will grow. You can't put salt water into a machine because it too will break. All human civilization depends upon nature's capacity and the third pole's capacity to regulate water, fresh water, and supply it to us. And it isn't much. It's 2.5% of the world's supply of water is fresh water. 90% of that is in the Antarctic. A bit far away from us to be able to use. So actually the third pole's capacity really does provide a huge proportion of the world's access to the thing that keeps us all alive, which is fresh water. And we use a lot of it, by the way. In case you hadn't won, you think, oh well, I'll drink less of this. The average human being uses 3 to 5 tons of fresh water every single day. That's how much we consume in agriculture, electricity for our lights, water from this, everything that is required to make our bread, our tsampa, our rice, everything that requires huge quantities of water. And we depend upon this in a massive level. Now, can I have the next slide, please? When it's not raining, when the water cycle isn't working, we depend upon the third pole. Therefore, for most of Asia's water supply during the dry months, we depend upon glaciers, we depend upon melting permafrost, we depend upon melting snow. Next slide, please. The problem with all of this is that this vital process that has allowed civilization in Asia to exist for thousands of years has been interrupted. People often speak about something called a tipping point. A tipping point is very strange. It's a sort of strange, mysterious thing. What's a tipping point? I'll tell you what a tipping point is. A tipping point is 0 degrees centigrade. That's the point at which the ice of the third pole turns to water. It's as simple as that. Everyone knows it. You all know it since you were kids, all right? If you look at this diagram here, you will see that the Tibetan Plateau's average temperature systematically went above 0 degrees centigrade in 1985. Ever since then, the cryosphere of the third pole has been progressively compromised. Next slide. We all know that this has led to the loss of glaciers. More substantially is its impact on underground permafrost. Next slide, please. This is permafrost as we estimate it, as its distribution underneath the ground in the 1960s. Those big blue areas, that's your deep, thick permafrost, okay? The areas that are red, it's sort of melting a bit and everything on those lines. The areas white, there's nothing left. Can I have the next slide? That's 2000. This is what we've already done. This, because most of this is overwhelmingly driven by CO2-based warming. It's a global problem. It's not a local problem. The change that's occurring this is an area the size of Western Europe. This change is driven by CO2 production around the world. Next slide, please. So what does that mean? It means, in a nutshell, and I'll summarize this, we can come back to it. 1, locally, for the 226 million people that live immediately around the Himalayas, land and slope collapse because permafrost is what holds together most of the mountains around here. It's like a glue that holds the rock together. If it melts, those rocks fall down under gravity. So land and slope collapse due to permafrost melt, damage to communities, buildings, roads, railways, gas and oil pipelines. 2, desertification. As ice turns to water, your water level falls under gravity within the earth. So suddenly, your roots of your grasses cannot reach the water. Your barley cannot reach the water. Even your rice cannot reach the water. It's too far down. It falls because the ice isn't holding it there. Thirdly, an increase in flood and drought cycles. We've been seeing this across the Himalaya in particular, and the southern Himalaya, Nepal Himalaya, the Indian Himalaya, all of these regions, we've seen an increase in this process in which you get catastrophic and almost uncontrollable floods, followed by long periods of drought. Finally, widespread freshwater access problems for industrial, agricultural, and human consumption. We're now reaching a point where very, very large slabs of the human race, most particularly in Asia, really do have very significant access problems to fresh water. And we need fresh water, in case I hadn't said it at the beginning, for everything. Our food, our electricity, our cars, our roads, to drink, all of these things. Without it, we come to an end. And that's where I will come to an end.
Thank you so much, Martin. I think your presentation laid the foundation of our discussion, and you also emphasized on the significance of the third pole and then water, and then you also dealt on the permafrost, and so I think we will have a more discussion later on. Thank you so much. So next speaker we have is joining from online, Professor Roland Senner. Professor Roland Senner is the president of URAC Research based in Italy, and he was a former president of the International Scientific Committee on Alpine Research. Professor Renner.
Hello, good morning, everybody. Yeah, dear participants, dear organizers, dear Lobsang colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, the last 2 days were full of exciting ideas dealing with global problems and solutions. Today we are talking about the third pole, which means to me that we are aware of what polar and mountain regions have in common. I have been studying high elevation and cryosphere ecosystems for many, many years. So I want to focus your attention on certain issues regarding the relationship between mountains and lowlands. So let's look also at the Alps, which I may call the little sister of the Himalayas. And what Martin Mills just told us about the Himalayas applies, so I think, to some other mountain areas. I'm here in Bolzano, Bozen in northern Italy, and the local newspapers 2 days ago have declared water war between the mountain areas, this is South Tyrol, Trentino, and the province of Venice, which is suffering from water shortage. The governor of the Veneto requests from his mountain neighbors to open the slushes. Venice and the region of Veneto, they need additionally about 80 cubic meters per second. Beside the large demands for irrigation, the region is in real shortage of drinking water, and the rivers need the higher discharge to push back the saltwater intrusion from the Adriatic Sea. And this is just a reminder of what is happening at a global scale. Although only a minor part of world population lives in mountain areas, these mountain areas provide the essential ecosystem services for humans. I admit that the definition of services is very anthropocentric, has a view of nature which is a bit strange, but these services are in jeopardy because of climate warming, biodiversity losses, and direct human impacts. I'm thinking at hydropower, roads, tourist resorts, mining, etc. So I see two principal questions for panel 3. The first is, do mountain regions suffer more strongly from climate change than lowlands? And Martin already gave an answer to that. And the second is, will changes in mountain areas exacerbate the consequences for the lowlands? Or otherwise, can mountains protect the lowlands from the worst effects of climate change? And to do so, do mountain populations have to sacrifice natural goods, for instance, the last remaining rivers, to avoid the worst effects of climate change for themselves and for others? And I see an additional question. Will this awareness lead us to a closer cooperation, or will we end up in a stronger competition between the poor and the technological advanced nations, between mountains and lowlands, between the affluent and the vulnerable people? As an ecologist, I see climate change as an ecological, of course, but also as an economic and, first of all, a social challenge. As His Holiness the Dalai Lama said recently and repeatedly, we need, beside technical and nature-based solutions, we need compassion and social equality to overcome the multiple crises which are threatening us since decades. I am convinced that we cannot pursue one goal by neglecting the importance of others. So I think this is the teaching of the SDGs. Do not omit one of them. So I try to focus on those questions with some examples. given in the PowerPoint presentation. I tried to show you. So, oh, you have it already. So I just say, please go on. Yeah. Next slide. Yeah, this is a nostalgic slide because it shows you a glacier which is, well, much, much smaller than the Himalayan glaciers, but it still was a glacier some 10 years ago. Next slide. Yeah, this was the situation after the end of the Little Ice Age, which had this maximum around 150 years ago. And this at the left side is 100 years later. This is at the border. Here is the border between Austria and Italy. And we thought that maybe now the Little Ice Age has ended and that is the end state. But if you show the next slide, then this happens now 20 years later, and you see that this glacier is disintegrating. And what my students are doing here on the right hand, they are not studying a glacier, they are studying dead ice. So this part of the glacier has always been separated from the rest. Now the next slide shows you something which is for a limnologist. I'm studying lakes. It's a very interesting phase in history. To me, it's almost like a flashback into the early Holocene. We are looking back 10,000 years when we can observe the generation of many, many, many lakes, both in the Himalayas and in the Alps and in other mountain regions. So it's not only a flashback, it's also kind of time lapse. We see also the evolution of lakes. Here you see a lake I photographed in 1985, and it's called the Green Mead Lake because it was green. And it has turned completely transparent to UV radiation. It has changed its character, and this is also everything is happening now in a time lapse, in fast motion. So next slide. And there is another effect. Martin has been talking about permafrost, and we have studied some effects of permafrost. This is a thawing permafrost rock glacier. And if you look at the next slide, you see that one of those effects is that thawing permafrost releases huge amounts. This is a small example, huge amounts of acidity. And with this acidity comes the dissolution of heavy metals. So the drinking water concentrations are not observed in many of those little lakes at the foot of permafrost, of thawing permafrost. We have lakes where the concentration of nickel, for instance, is 100 times above the level of drinking water. So next slide. Yeah, this was the vision we had for a long time. What is the function of mountains? Here in the case of the Alps, it's the water tower. The Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau is the water tower of Asia. And you can see the big difference. Without mountains, we had only a third or a quarter of the discharge we have from the Alps. But the situation I want to show, and this is one of the aspects where I'm talking about, can we prefer one good above the other, is the next slide. You see that the spatial distribution of large hydropower plants, it's very astonishing. We have many of these hydropower plants, and if you look at the next slide, you see that there are even more beyond those existing are under construction or planned. And the last slide shows part of a letter that concerned scientists have sent to the Austrian Minister of the Environment and the Vice Chancellor. And they are arguing that the high degree of expansion in the hydropower sector is already causes a fragmentation of watercourses. We have in Austria, it's a little country, more than 5,200 plants. And with the increasing fragmentation and degradation, it will be impossible to stop or even reverse the current trend of biodiversity loss. And we know now that the biodiversity loss in the aquatic ecosystems are higher than in terrestrial ones. So this is also a kind of plea that if we try to solve the problem with the water discharge and the availability of water, we shall not forget that we have also the biodiversity problem, and biodiversity problem maybe is equivalent to the water problem. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you so much. And I feel that it's very interesting to study both the water tower of Asia and then water tower of Europe as well. And so I think you also covered so many issues that is also related with the Tibet third pole in terms of permafrost and grassland degradation, permafrost, and then glaciers melting, and then you also focused on the hydropower, and I think it's very much relevant, and so there is this scope that we can do a comparative study and what we can learn from each other. And thank you so much. And so now we have our third speaker, Temba Gyamtse Zamla, and he was a former interim deputy director of Tibet Policy Institute of Central Tibetan Administration, and he was also the head of the former head of the Environment and Development Desk of Tibet Policy Institute under CTA. And so currently he's pursuing a degree in Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Innsbruck, Austria. And
thank you very much, Lobsang. It feels really excited and also happy that there's either a scientific paper or a research paper or a news article on Tibet's environment almost every day. But it wasn't the same some 10 years ago. And I have been working with the environment desk of Central Tibet Administration since 2011. And we started working at a time when there were very few individuals, few institutions, few NGOs who work on Tibet's environment. So we really focused on highlighting the global ecological importance of the Tibetan Plateau on the global stage, and also understand impact of climate change for the Tibetans. And today, as Dr. Martin has very elaborately and very interestingly highlighted issues that I used to cover. So I will try to do something different. I'm not too sure it will go well or not, because I'm going to cover on the issue that I have not talked about, but I think issue that will highlight some facts about Tibet and how it was before Chinese occupation. Now, begin with a small story. It was in 1993, just few months after my arrival here in India, and I had my relatives in South India, and there's a place called Kodaikanal. I'm sure some of you know. It's a beautiful place in South India. And I was there, and a friend of mine took me to visit some of the gardens and scenic spot in there. And it was a beautiful place, and I enjoyed the visit gardens and scenic spots. But what surprised me was that I had paid 25 rupees at that time. It was in 1993. So after the visit to the gardens and the scenic spot, I told my friend that I was, as someone freshly arrived from Tibet, I said, it's so surprising that we have to pay to visit gardens and scenic spots. Because in Tibet, during the summer, the whole of Tibet is a natural garden by itself. I'm sure Kung and other elder Tibetans would know about it. Because during the summer, the snow-capped mountains, you see the snow-covered peaks almost throughout the year, all 12 months. And then you have the streams running across villages and towns. I have many small rivers running by my homes. And we used to, every time we want to drink something, we just lie down on the ground and directly sip from those rivers. And then I remember playing with my friends on the ground, on those meadows, full of flowers. And when you get up, you see the colors of flowers on your hands and on your clothes. But that was before I came here in India. And it was a view of a Tibetan who freshly arrived here in India, who knew nothing about the world, who knew nothing about climate change, environmental issues, and global politics. But I was very clear. I was very clear that Tibetan Plateau was one of the most beautiful places on earth. In summer, I mean, in summer. Now, the view that I had as a young kid was also echoed by someone who's not a Tibetan. So, a British explorer, his name Francis Kingdon Ward, who visited Tibet between 1910 and 1935 when Tibet was still independent. And during his visit, he described Tibet as, I quote, this is important, it's a description of Tibet during its independence. Tibet is a one great zoological garden. This sums up a lot about what Tibet looks like in those days. And there's another British explorer, again, who visited Tibet between 1903 and 1905, Captain Rowling. And in his book, The Great Plateau, he said, this is what he said, I quote, "There are herds of thousands upon thousands of antelopes and their young cubs across the Chantang as far as his eye can reach." So he said, possibly about 15,000 to 20,000 at one look. So that was what was in Tibet before its independence. But in the present time, Chinese government talk about increasing wildlife. Increasing not what it was before independence, but increasing from what was exterminated during Chinese invasion of Tibet. So that we need to understand. Now, the views expressed by two British explorers were further corroborated by an American adventurer, and his name is Leonard Clark, who visited Tibet in the 1940s. And you know what he said? He said in his book titled The Marching Wind, he said, Tibet as the one of the last unspoiled big game paradise. Unspoiled. So he's American. I'm sure America was highly industrialized at that point of time. But when he visited Tibet, he saw it as an unspoiled paradise. Now, of course, it was in 1933 when a Swiss explorer, a very famous explorer, after exploring much of European mountains, he wanted to explore something more. And Marcel Kurz visited the Mount Everest region, and after seeing the amount of glacier out there, he said, this must be Earth's third pole. And that's when the term third pole was first ever used. Of course, his friend who sponsored early expedition to the Tibetan Plateau brought out a book titled To the Third Pole, The History of High Himalayas, if I'm correct, in 1954. But for the Tibetans, we always knew that Tibetan Plateau we always call our land as snowland paradise. So this gives you an understanding of the land and its appearance, its ecological importance. Now, why Tibetan Plateau is called third pole, as Martin already mentioned, it has 46,000 glaciers across the plateau. And the Tibetan Plateau is not just the Himalayas. It has 14 great mountain ranges running parallel to each other from north to south, east to west. 14 great mountain ranges. And each of these mountains have glaciers on their peaks in their valleys. And these glaciers, as Marty already mentioned, are not simple glaciers. These glaciers, when the melting of these glaciers, seasonal melting of these glaciers, support 6 most important rivers in Asia. Of course, dozens other transboundary rivers. So basically, Tibetan rivers support population in the 10 most densely populated nations on earth. If I name them, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, China. So if you combine the population of those countries, it's more than 1.8 billion. So it's a massive population that Tibetan rivers support. And historically, also, Tibetan rivers have supported growth of some famous civilization. The Indus civilization in India flourished on the bank of Indus River, which originated from Tibetan Plateau. The Yellow civilization in China flourished on a river that originated from Tibet as Machu. And the Yalung civilization in Tibet flourished on the Yalung River, Yalung-Tsangpo River. So it's absolutely evident that Tibetan Plateau is the soul of Asian rivers, and that a healthy flow of Tibetan rivers is necessary for a healthy flow of Asian rivers is necessary. For a healthy flow of Asian rivers, protection of Tibetan Plateau is absolutely necessary. Unfortunately, ever since Chinese occupation of Tibet in the 1950s, the culture in Tibet, the kind of culture we had in Tibet, the culture of respecting nature, the culture of protecting lakes, rivers, mountains, forests, wild animals, and glaciers has been undermined by a colonial culture that has been imposed in Tibet. And the colonial rule that wants to take up everything possibly available in the occupied land for the development of China. So in this process, China built hundreds of dams, and China is building and planning to build one of the biggest dams on earth, and which means the flow of the Asian rivers would be disturbed. And also increasing number of mining across Tibet has resulted in release of mine waste into those rivers and pollution of those rivers. There has been instances. To end with 1 minute left, to end that, I'll give you four examples here. First, the Brahmaputra that we call here in India, we call it Yalung-Tsangpo in Tibet, was running black for 1 whole month. And people speculated different reasons. But the primary reason, as a research, was because of release of construction waste by the Chinese railway construction companies based along the Yalung-Tsangpo. And there's another case that was in 2017, November 2017. And there's another case, Tibetan river called Nyakchu, which is one of the biggest tributary of Yangtze River, the longest river in Asia, was polluted by release of lithium mine waste, and which resulted in mass death of fish, and people were not able to drink from those rivers. So someone like me who used to drink directly from those rivers, when I go back to Tibet, the situation will not be the same. I won't feel safe to go lie down on a river that flows around my village to drink, because things have changed. Things have changed because of Chinese occupation, because of a colonial rule and colonial policy that has imposed destruction of Tibetan Plateau. But of course, Tibetan people, Chinese government, international community can and should work together for the protection of Tibetan Plateau, because it is need for all. The rivers in Tibet, we have thousands of rivers. These big rivers are not, they definitely support growth of vegetation, but not necessarily as a drinking water for us. We have thousands of it. Therefore, these great rivers are more important for countries beyond the Tibetan border. So we need to support it, we need to protect it. That's what we need to do. And of course, we can discuss more during the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tembala. So earlier in your presentation, you were talking about your homeland. In fact, me and Tembala, we are from the same Payul, same homeland from Tibet, and I was also born in Tibet. So when he was sharing his story, so that reminded me of my Payul. And so after escaping here in India, then I had a chance to visit my family after a really long time in 2016. And so that time, that time, I got a chance to visit and then saw my land, and the story about when I was in Tibet, how you can drink the river that's flowing just in front of your hometown. And so when in 2016 I went home, so that river is not drinkable at all, and it's so sad to see how the environment has damaged over there. the kind of pollution, the kind of waste and lack of waste management in every village that I have visited. So anyways, we'll have more time to discuss on that. And then thank you, Tembala, also for talking about colonialism, and we'll have more discussion on that. And then also the damming and the importance of working together and collaboration. So we have our final speaker. Thank you for being so patient. And we have final speaker, Manshi Asher, and she is an environment justice activist and researcher from Himachal. So she has been associated with the several organizations, and she has also co-founded an autonomous collective called Himdara to land support and then to work from the grassroots levels. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lobsang. And I would like to first of all thank my learned and fellow speakers who've kind of laid out the landscape for me to zoom into a micro situation. I'm going to talk about the political economy and political ecology of dams in this western Himalayan region. And I'll try and illustrate through some examples of the downstream region of the Sutlej river basin to kind of talk about how the hydropower projects have kind of impacted the local ecology and livelihoods. And I'll also try and then link it with the larger climate narrative that is ongoing currently. So on the 6th of November, as our world leaders had gathered for pardon my cynicism, what I like to call yet another cop-out, millions of people, marched in different parts of the world demanding climate justice and climate action on the Global Day of Climate Action. And on that day, a small group of young men in a tiny district in Himachal Pradesh raised slogans saying hydropower is not clean and green, stop greenwashing mega dams, and no means no. And the region I'm referring to is the tribal district of Kinnaur, which is just in the borderlands. It's in the high Himalayas, the greater Himalayan region. It's part of the Sutlej Valley, and the Sutlej River Basin forms 45% of the total geographical area of Himachal Pradesh. It's the largest kind of river in Himachal Pradesh and the largest river basin. And it's also in the middle of a climate crisis. It has seen a 97% rise in glacial lakes, and all the other climate science details have already been given by others, so I won't get into that. But on this river alone, in the 320 odd kilometer stretch in Himachal, there are 150 small, medium, and large dams that have already been commissioned, are under construction, and are also planned. And like Dr. Roland kind of said, that this is not just this is not just this river valley, but if you look at the entire Indian Himalayan region, it is one of the most, and if all the dams are built, will be one of the most dam dense regions in the world. And many of these are mega dams. We are not talking about small micro hydropower plants. Now, if we look at the movements, people's movements in Kinnaur against these, raising voices against these dams in the last 2 decades, why is it that they are saying no means no? So we are looking at a landscape where people are dependent on forests, people are dependent on land and horticulture for their day-to-day livelihoods. We are looking at a landscape which is largely arid, but springs or groundwater play a very important role in irrigation, in drinking water, etc. And what has happened with the bumper-to-bumper construction of what are called run-of-the-river hydropower plants, which involve large-scale underground as well as surface-level construction. So the underground construction is basically building of tunnels using the drill and blast method, where tunnels are used to divert river water. And then you have a cascade of projects, on one river basin. So the head of one project is the tail of the next, and this goes on through the valley, where if all the projects are built, then 70% of the Sutlej river will be running through the tunnels, and about 22% of it will be behind reservoirs. So what this construction, large-scale surface and underground construction has done is disturbed the already fragile geology of the area, which is impacted by, also impacted by flash floods, landslides, slope destabilization. This has further exacerbated, and because of the change in the land use and the deforestation also that has occurred because of large-scale building of dams. And this in turn has impacted local lives and livelihoods, compromising safety. Last year in the monsoons, a bus was crushed under a landslide. It became international news, but very few people know that that area was also in the alignment of a hydropower project, as in that there was a tunnel passing through that area. But it's very difficult to draw linkages between there hasn't been enough scientific research to establish that these projects have disturbed the local geologies, especially micro-scientific studies. There needs to be more review. But local experience has raised these issues. Horticulture has been impacted because of the dust, and the muck dumping has further, muck dumping of all the debris that comes out of these tunnels is dumped along the riverside, and when the river comes in spate, it increases the force of the river and causes more damage downstream. So it has turned an already disaster-prone area into a hazardscape, and turns disasters into tragedies actually. And this is one of the reasons why people are now kind of raising their voice against these dams and saying that they don't want any further dams to be constructed, especially in the upper reaches of the Sutlej Valley. Now, if we look at the dam building process and how it began in the Himalayan, in the Sutlej Valley itself, it was post 1990s that you saw this construction start. With the Kyoto Protocol and the Rio Summit, there was a focus on climate change mitigation and the thrust towards clean energy projects. And post 2000, the clean development mechanism was used to fund these projects. The Asian Development Bank and World Bank, through their clean energy missions, also funded many of these projects. Many private players were funded, and in Kinnaur itself, like 4 of the big dams are CDM projects. The others have been funded by ADB and World Bank. So if you kind of look at the political economy, and now we have the net zero target. We have a new energy policy in 2021 in the state, which is pushing for further hydropower development. So Himachal has already tapped. It's the hydropower state of the country. It has already built projects worth 10,900 megawatts, and it's going to double the capacity in the next couple of years. If you look at the Himalayan region as a whole, there is the vulnerability is has already been studied in terms of there was a research by German researchers from the Potsdam University who found that they studied 273 odd mega dams in this region, and they found that 25% of them are vulnerable to some kind of landslide or seismic activity, and that they would be damaged because of it. So not only are these dams acting as force multipliers for when there is a flash flood or landslide, etc., but they're also themselves vulnerable. So it raises a question mark on the economic and financial viability of these dams, and there's enough data to talk about that. Now I'm just going to conclude by talking about when we look at the Himalayan region, the entire perception now is that this is a region full of uncertainties. It's a disaster-prone region. It's a crisis-prone region. But there was a time when this diverse ecosystem was known for its resilience. It provided the diversity in the ecosystem, especially in the Western Himalayas. If you look at the kind of altitudinal zones available to people and the movement that people did, like, the forest produce collected from the higher regions. And I want to talk about the biodiversity fragmentation also, which has happened, habitat fragmentation, which has happened in Kinnaur. Endangered species like the Chilgoza pine have kind of started disappearing, and most of these have been deforested because of the hydropower plants. But coming back, these were, and the people, the livelihoods they practiced were evolved with the local, kind of ecology and the geography, and they were suited to it, and there was a high level of adaptability. And now the same resilience has been, kind of compromised, and the sustainability that once existed has been compromised because of several political, economic, and social factors, which cannot just be, hidden behind larger climate change. So we need to look into what are the localized, what are the localized factors, what are the locational factors that are impacting, what are the domestic policies, the national and state policies, especially those driven by neoliberal, growth and extractive industries, extractive development. We need to look at how they have affected the, existing land base and existing forest base, water security. We need to talk also, we can't just talk about resilience and sustainability without talking about equity and justice and sovereignty. So we are, not just in terms of the ownership of the resources, who now the people are actually, struggling for protecting their landscape. So I would say that this is a climate action movement, what is happening in Kinnaur, what the youth are doing. That's really part of climate action. And the fact that they are calling out false solutions, that is also part of climate action. We should see it as part of climate action. And we need to develop, a climate justice approach, which kind of involves local actors, especially the most vulnerable communities, indigenous people, women, those who are landless and dependent on the forests and the commons, in production of knowledge and policy making. And that is where I'll end, and I'll add more if I get a chance.
Thank you so much, Marshi. I mean, it's very interesting to study and have a discussion on what's happening in India and also on the Himalaya region, and specific case study in Kinnaur, and that has lots of similarity and historical relation with the Tibet as well. And you also focused on the climate justice, equity, and sovereignty, and then the role of youth and the local people in terms of environment conservation. Thank you so much. So now we'll go to our Q&A session, and me being the moderator, let me take a privilege to ask few questions to our speakers, and then we'll open the floor to our participants. And my first question is to Martin is that earlier Temba Genzela spoke about the Chinese occupation of Tibet, and then how is that related in terms of environment disaster in Tibet as well. So I would like to focus more on that. Sometimes we tend to neglect the whole the colonialism part, and then just focus too much on the climate change or climate crisis. So my question to you is, can one link the environment mismanagement on the Tibetan Plateau to the 60 years of Chinese colonialism, and then its subsequent violence on the Tibetan Plateau? So can you share your views?
Okay, yeah, I'll address that. That's fine, because it's quite a regular question. And it relates to a certain extent, certainly around here, it relates to a certain extent in the question of what we would refer to as drivers. Okay, what is it that drives ecological change, climate warming, all of those kinds of things? And as far as this is concerned, you've got your local level ones, you've got your regional level ones, and you've got your global level ones. And in terms of the scientific literature, if you build a city, you're going to warm the area around it. You're going to generate an area, particularly if you're polluting, you're going to generate a kind of haze of pollution around it that will concentrate heat. Those local practices, so railway building, economic development areas, such as, for example, the economic zone that follows across the Tibetan Plateau to the north around the railway. The railway itself may not harm terribly because they worked really, really hard to make certain it wouldn't. But then they built a big economic zone around it. So all of those things have local effects. If you have a city near a glacier, that glacier is gonna melt more because of the heat that's generated. So that's a local level effect. The regional level effects are, particularly on the Tibetan Plateau, for example, largely involves what are called black carbon particulates. They emerge from regional production, particularly of inefficient burning of crops, things on these lines. Now, as far as this is concerned, when it comes to the third pole region, there are two principal sources of that. One, the first, comes out of the Mongolian coal-fired burning areas. And we can trace this because you can do carbon-14 breakdowns that have signatures that show you where this stuff comes from. When that kind of stuff lands on ice, it's like putting on a dark coat on a hot day. It generates heat and it pulls it into it and it causes melting. The second major source is the Endogangetic Plane, in which we are basically on the edge of here. There is very large quantity of black carbon deposition and brown carbon deposition that is landing on the Himalayas and is having a substantial effect, and that is overwhelmingly from the south. And a lot of this is about the way the wind blows. So that's your second. The third source, as far as this is concerned, is overall CO2 production. As far as that's concerned, those impacts escalate and multiply as you go from local to regional to global. The really big dominant one is by a factor of several, I'm afraid, really is general CO2 production. Now, of course, general CO2 production around the world, China, it produces 20% of the CO2 production, global CO2 production. But we have to remember here that a lot of this CO2 production is legacy CO2 production. The changes on the Tibetan Plateau, the tree ring changes, the earliest registered changes to tree rings that signify the beginning of climate change are as early as the early 1800s. Not far after the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Now, the Tibetan Plateau is incredibly sensitive because of its height, like the Andes, like the Alps. So in that sense, it's a very early register. That's why the climate change was first really registered in the Andes, for example. And so in this sense, we are dealing with also the production, because CO2 stays in the atmosphere. Each of us breathes out. That CO2 will stay in the atmosphere, according to NASA figures, for 300 to 1,000 years. That's each of our breaths just now. So our question is, what legacy do we leave behind? But really the big driver here is CO2. But yes, local solutions mitigate these issues. Mm-hmm. They can't totally eradicate them then, but they have to. And the local question is one we'll come back to possibly later.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Martin. And so I think you are very right. And I also, still feels that, the Chinese occupation of Tibet is the root cause of the environment mismanagement in Tibet. And so I think the kind of problem that you discussed in your answer is very much there, and I think in the future we can have a more discussion on that. So my second question is Professor Roland. Professor Roland, so when we talk about climate justice and then how we relate with the climate crisis and the human rights, so there is this also issue of joint scientific research among the whole area. And so your institute, the URAC, you have lots of collaboration with the Himalaya region and also at the UN level. So my question is, were you able to have any collaboration work or were you able to have any access for joint research on the Tibetan Plateau? And if yes, so were you able to include Tibetan experts or the scientists or environmentalists in your research? And if no, then why do you think that we don't have access for the joint research in Tibet?
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, URAC, of course, we have at the scientific level, we have all these cooperations with the world, and we are connected now with the United Nations University. They have a focus on mountain areas because they have understood that mountain areas are essential for the ecosystem services we need. And we are connected with the ICIMOD, for instance, and we have several institutes at URAC which are dealing with climate change from different aspects and with different connections in the world. But what we are doing now is to create a kind of cooperative center where we are not divided in institutes of, let's say, studying biodiversity, studying glaciers, the study of water courses, energy, saving energy, high altitude medicine, and all these things. So we are trying now to combine these and to cooperate with scientists in the whole world to have a complete picture of what is going on and what is affecting our systems. So my point was more, and I think it was especially Tenpa Gyaltsen Samla's perspective, which is, to me, it's striking another chord. Yeah, the scientific cooperation, I think, is working quite easily, and it does not depend whether you have you speak different languages or live in different countries. But what I think it's even more important is to have this common feeling, to have the perspective that has given to us Tenpa Gyaltsen Samla, that we have not just the quantitative and not the technical aspects of climate change, but we have also a deeper understanding of what is going on. And therefore, and I would really have loved to be with you, but it was not possible this time. I still don't know why. So I would have been with you, because I know that the contact between scientists does not only depend on the internet, it depends also on the exchange and the study of different systems on the encounters.
Thank you, Professor. I think as also Martin also raised in your presentation about the lack of joint scientific research, and unless or until we don't have a transparency and a joint research on the Tibetan Plateau, so it's very, very difficult to talk about the solutions or so I think we have lots of challenges when we talk about third pole. So my question is to Tenpa Gyaltsen. So earlier you in your articles you talk about the role of Buddhism or the Peril religion with the environment conservation in Tibet, and you also focused about the sacred mountains and so its role in environment conservation. So my question is, how have the Tibetans understood the perspective and their view on the sacred mountains, and how has that helped in terms of environment conservation?
Thank you very much, Lobsang. Please allow me to answer something you asked Martin, and then I will go to the question you asked me, and I will be really brief, try to be brief. And the question about colonial rule and its effects on the Tibet ecology, I really want to highlight 4 points. And number one, if you have a careful reading of what happened in Tibet since Chinese occupation on its environment, it's clear that there are 4 different paces in it. And the first is between 1950 and 1960. There was a mass killing of wild animals. And that was probably because as the People's Liberation Army marched into Tibet, they were badly fed. Chinese People's Liberation Army, they were nationalists, but they were poor. They had very little to eat. So they were killing wild animals across Tibet, and there were enough real-life accounts about that. So there was a mass killing of animals between 1950 and the 60s, and then between 1970 and 1998, until 1998, there was a state-sponsored deforestation in Tibet. And then between 1900 till between 1990 till I would say till 2015, there was unregulated, excessive mining, resource extraction across Tibet. Of course, it has got a little more regulated in recent years. And then in recent years, since 2000, of course there were damage before, but particularly since 2000 until now, and continue to happen, there is excessive construction of dams. So these 4 different paces clearly indicate that colonialism or the colonial rule of China in Tibet has clearly done massive damage to Tibet's environment. Now, coming back to the question that you put to me about sacred mountains, and this is an issue that I'm really interested in, and I wrote an article on it, which was published in a book brought out by FNVA. And what was, I'm sure Marty must have read some of the papers produced by different scientists about the sacred mountains. Mm-hmm. It is very interesting. You know what the scientists have wrote is that most of the scientists who did research on Tibet's sacred mountains visited Eastern Tibet, around Mount Kawakabu and Anyamachin and other sacred regions. And they found what this is. This is a very Western perspective, but still it adds a lot of value. They said, this is what they said: we don't know if this God or something really existed in those mountains or not. That's Western perspective, right? But Tibettv, we said, yes, it existed. But what they added is, but the very belief in the sacredness of the mountains has helped in protection of Tibet's environment for the last many centuries. Mm-hmm. This is absolutely true, because in Tibet, those of you have been, we have sacred mountains, sacred lakes, sacred rivers. In Tibet, we are not allowed to pee in the rivers. We say there's the presence of God in every, what do you call this in English, every stretch of your hand. And also we say the sacred mountain, there's the presence of God in the sacred mountain. So, and some forests we are not allowed to cut. And we are not allowed to shout aloud near a glaciated mountain. They say that would anger the gods. But now looking back, looking at the present, after doing some research for the last 10 years, I realized that if you shout aloud, the echo creates avalanche. And then also forest, not all forests are sacred. Highly diversified forests are sacred because people have to live, right? So Tibetans were very careful in designate which forest should be sacred, which mountain should be sacred. And we have sacred hills, but not the hills which are located just between the villages. If that happens, then life would be difficult. But it is the highest peak or the most important location, or a river, or a mountain where a small stream just comes out from. So this clearly indicates that sacred mountains have clearly supported. But unfortunately, again, which comes to colonialism or the Chinese culture, dominance of Chinese culture. If we say, now that culture of respecting nature existed in Tibet, but if you see more Chinese coming into those towns and cities, gradually it will become dominant Chinese population who hasn't inherited the culture of respecting sacred mountains. So that how they look at mountains would be different, and that belief would be gone, and that sacredness would be gone.
Very, very short.
Okay, very short answer. All right. No, I want to agree with you completely there. I don't want to go with the sacred mountain thing, although I'd love to, but I'd never stop. The real question here, I think, is this question of what is developing a kind of climate change paternalism, which is, and here I would encourage particularly our readers to think, listeners to think about this in the sense of the demand that big government solves this problem. Big government solving problems tend to produce big government solutions, and big government solutions to things like, for example, slowing down the water cycle tend to be things like huge dams. We know the damage that huge dams create. Reservoir-induced seismicity has been understood since the 1930s, that effectively speaking, if you make a big enough dam, it will cause its own earthquake. And it will be a signature earthquake, and you'll be able to spot it. The classic example here that is widely debated in the literature is the Zipumpu Dam changes that occurred just prior to the 2008 Sichuan earthquake, where the water began dripping down. Basically, the water goes down, it hits the underground fault zone, it becomes hot, it turns to gas, it becomes a lubricant, and you have an earthquake. Now, what was interesting there, and just to demonstrate that point, was that when the Zipumpu Dam, when the 2008 earthquake occurred, it occurred in the Bijuan fault, which was 500 meters from the dam. Yeah. 2,558 other dams were damaged in the process. That shows how densely this region is dammed. This is mass damming to produce a single response. Now, I hasten to add here, personally, I'm not totally opposed to dams. I think a small dam is a good idea. Small dams, add trees, add artificial glaciers, produce an ecology that depends upon local knowledge and local people who know the area. This is the problem with leaving it all to a big government. You get a big government solution that is one size fits all, rather than depending upon that level of local expertise and engagement. It isn't enough to demand your governments do things. All of us actually have to get involved. And the first thing we need to do, actually, learn about our own local environment. I'll leave it there.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. I'll have a very short question to Manji, and then we'll open floor to our audience, and I will request our speakers to have a very short answer, and also the audience to have a very specific and short question as well. So Manji, and Martin also raised about the dam, and then Timbala also, but then when we look about the water that flows from Tibet, right? I mean, from the individual action, yes, I mean, you can educate, and awareness is very important, but then when the states are there and they are the ones who have a power to build a big dams, right? So on the Tibetan Plateau, China has the upstream superpower, right? And because of that, they don't have any water agreement of any of the downstream nations. And what you talk about the Sutlej, and then also in the Brahmaputra rivers, so what's happening there, because of the large dams, lack of scientific research and access and transparency. So we have a lot of catastrophic impact on the human and nature as well. So do you think in the future there is a possibility of having an effective transboundary water management with the downstream nations, even in Mekong or in South Asia? Do you think that we'll have a body of the governments, downstream governments, including China, where where it becomes accountable for people and effective management in terms of transboundary rivers?
This is like a hornet's nest. Sorry, because the thing is that it's so geopolitically fraught, this entire region, and there's all these conflicts, and if you look at what is happening with the transboundary issues with the Indus, with Pakistan, and the same thing with China, I think that there is a scope for transboundary exchange and dialogue between communities, but for that there's a lot of openness and trust which is required, which is absent at present, and it's dominated by the larger strategic concerns. So whenever we speak about the Himalayan region, it's always the geopolitical and strategic concerns that are talked about, or there is larger kind of climate science is there, but there isn't anything about local dialogues. And whereas those dialogues existed at one point of time, there was an exchange, there was trade, or there were other forms of exchange. And of course, with, Pakistan, it was one country at one point. So, part of the same kind of land base. So I think that, yeah, we are a very long way from it, but at least people who are talking about transformative change need to start talking about transboundary dialogue and look at what are the possibilities there, and that again will require putting at some point mobilizing to put pressure on governments also, but it has to start at least internally in spaces like this. What are the possibilities? And we need to learn from what have been the good examples of transboundary dialogues across the world. So we need to look at good practices, good examples as well, to get inspired from it and see what can happen.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Marshi. Now we'll open the floor to audience, and I would request audience to please ask your question, and please identify yourself, and then please say who your question asking for, and please be the. Can we have the microphone? Okay. And please be very, very short and direct.
I will try. Hi, my name is Sushma. So I live in Dharamshala since the last 6 years, and my question is to Manshi. Regarding what you said about, very interesting how you brought up that some of the budget that goes towards greening our country goes into projects like hydropower projects, right? So it's in a way, it's kind of misdirected. And so what do you feel would bridge the gap? Like what is required at this time for us to be able to have that power over the government, to be able to, basically for academics and for governance to be on the same page, because the information is already there, but it's not being used and it's not being implemented, basically because politics is acting more as a setback.
Thank you. I'll take 2 more questions, and then we'll have Gunther, please.
We don't have the microphone.
We have.
Okay, thank you. Well, actually, it's not so much a question as a comment. My name is Günther Kolonia. I'm one of the organizers in the name of the institution Eurek Research, whose president is on the screen. No, I wanted to point to a big paradox that we are dealing with about hydroelectric power generation. I come from an area in the mountains. We produce more electricity than we need ourselves, because there are other regions in the lowlands, industrialized regions that need the energy and that get it from us. The paradox I see here is that how is electricity generated? It's generated in coal power plants, it's generated in diesel power plants, in gas power plants, in nuclear power plants. All these have very negative side effects on the environment. And hydroelectric power is, so to say, clean power. And I think that is why you have seen this great increase in dam construction, because after Rio, after Kyoto and Paris, countries need to meet their emissions targets. And in order to have enough electricity available, what governments do is they find other sources, and damming provides a clean source of electricity generation. And until very recently, solar and wind were not able to produce enough energy. We are slowly moving in that direction, but I think governments were doing this in an environmentally conscious way in terms of emissions reductions, of mitigation. So the problem is we have this paradox. They are doing this to be better and to pollute less. Of course, on the ground, we have all the negative consequences for agriculture, for farming, for biodiversity, and all that Manshi mentioned. But I wanted to point to this paradox. So they're not doing it to harm the environment, they're doing it to do something good for the environment and for the air that we breathe. That's a problem that we might have to deal with.
Sure. Thank you, Gunda. Yeah, Krista.
Thank you very much. My name is Krista Meindersma, also one of the organizers and with the International Campaign for Tibet. My question is to Martin Mills. Martin, you wrote a seminal report last year on the state of the effects of climate change on the third pole. I was not sleeping for many nights after reading this. It's terrible. The consequences, if you really take serious what you say in that report, the consequences for almost half of the world's population are dire because of what's happening on the third pole. So I was just wondering, what motivated you to write this? Thank you.
Sure. I think we already had three questions. So I would request to have a very, very short, maybe in 1 or 2 minutes answer, so that we'll have more time for discussion.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I address those two questions?
Yeah.
Firstly, as far as the motivation is concerned, we were motivated in the cross-party group in Scotland by a combination of inspiration. We were inspired by Isimod's report on the Hindu Kush Himalaya, which was a truly excellent work. Perhaps not for everybody's reading, because it's about 700 pages. So we wanted to transform that into something readable. We were also struck by frustration, and the frustration comes from this, and I do inspire our listeners out there to kind of pay attention to this. There is an unspoken division of intellectual labor that occurs when it comes to the organization of knowledge about climate change on the world stage. If you read an IPCC report, and I'm professionally paid to do such things, you will notice that it is organized largely in terms of themes. It is organized in terms of mountains, rivers, glaciers, seas, everything on those lines. What you don't get, and is not produced by the IPCC, is this kind of work. This is what we refer to as a regional assay. It asks what happens to a particular area, in this case the third pole and its surrounding region, when you put all of those different climate change processes together, because they produce often paradoxical results. Lots of glaciers melting should produce more water. Why are we getting less? Because of the permafrost problem. Now, here's the thing. The IPCC largely do that because national governments are uncomfortable with the idea of the IPCC producing regional assays for a particular country. Why? Because there are actually national security issues that go with that. It is a national security question. It's a national interest question. But I'll tell you this, every government in the world that is even halfway competent will have produced one of these for their area. But most of us don't know what they say. Now, in open nations and open countries, you have civil society organizations, such as Isimod, for example, that can produce this and put it out on the open stage. But this isn't the reports that governments receive. The President of the United States, whether or not it is Obama or Donald Trump, will have received these reports. We know the UK government received these reports. But they don't become publicly available despite the fact that they will tell you in concrete details what is expected, and expected is the best we've got because climate change is constantly unpredictable. It does new things all the time that confuse us. But that will say, well, this is what it's going to be like in your area. As a consequence, because of the lack of that, there is a tendency to think of climate change as an abstract thing, as a thing that sort of floats up in the air, as a themed thing, rather than something that says, this is what is happening here. If you're listening to this, ask your government what they know. And if they don't know anything, then you've got bigger questions to ask.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to Gunther's comment first that actually, there is this question of, us considering hydropower as renewable because water, the source from which it is produced, as clean, and that one of the aspects of that clean is the renewable, source of water, but then there is a question mark about what is happening with river discharge as well. So how sustainable is it, and what's going to happen in the long run is something that needs to be considered. Also, I think that when we are looking at carbon footprint, we also need to look at the material footprints, and when what all is instrumentalized in the process of building of a dam. Whether it is the cement which is being transported to build concrete structures, whether it is, the deforestation that's taking place, or the iron and the different kinds of mining that happens to get in all the building material is one example of that. Or the transmission lines that are constructed to, to transmit the power out of the Himalayas. I mean, that has a huge footprint because of the kind of deforestation it involves, because it all goes to a centralized grid. So the questions of decentralized production also need to come in instead of just talking about technology. So the questions are essentially changes, in the economic policies and in the energy policies, where we're talking about security, we're talking about sovereignty, and we're talking about decentralization. So that is what I wanted to say about that. And also to, respond to Sushma's question, I think I want to go to what Tempela said about the colonial influence. I mean, if we are looking at institutional mechanisms and political systems and bureaucratic systems that are rooted in our colonial histories, and then have been working in a certain way, and then policies that have further kind of entrenched the same top-down hierarchical ways of working, then democratic processes are bound to be compromised. And then if the climate policies and the climate adaptation mitigation is happening through those same institutions, it's bound to be problematic. It's bound to exacerbate the problems of inequity and whatever, I mean, lack of participation or centralization that happens. Now, like one example that I wanted to give about this greening and greenwashing, the whole idea of carbon offset, I think we need to also really review whether we can, continue doing damage in one place and then offset it by trying to repair it in some other landscape. What about that particular habitat? What about that particular landscape? Why are we not talking about plugging, or stopping? Why are we talking about let's continue doing this, but we offset it in another place where we are actually causing more damage? So one of the studies that we did on afforestation projects showed that, the plantation in Kinnaur, this was as offset to all the hydro projects that were happening as compensatory afforestation. And it has further compromise the composition of the forest because targets have to be achieved. So exotic or non-native species are being planted because they're fast growing, they're not grazed by the locals. They're being planted in places where the survival rates are poor, so less than 10%. And they are being planted in places where which were grasslands, where people are, grazing their livestock, they practice livelihoods in violation of their forest rights, of their grazing rights. So it's actually causing more damage. So first there's a damage by the dam, and then there's a damage by the compensatory afforestation, which is an offset for the dam. So it's just multiplying the problems.
Sure, thank you.
May I add a comment to that?
Sure, definitely.
Yeah, so I see the Alps a little bit, and what's happening in the Alps, it's like in a nutshell of what is happening in the third pole, the Himalayas. I think also in the so-called free countries, it's quite difficult to argue against some paradigm. The paradigm that hydropower is green, I think it's one of these wrong paradigms because it's not green. If you ask children in Europe, in the Alps, do you know what's a river? They don't have seen a river. Yeah, there is only one river remaining, and this is in the northeast of Italy. It's a Tagliamento, a free-flowing river. It's the only one in Central Europe. But let me add to the dams. There are some interesting numbers. If you look at the dams in the Alps, you have the large dams, the medium-sized, and the small dams. And 3% of the dams, the large dams, they produce 80% of electricity. The 3%, the 80% of the small dams, that are many, many small dams, they produce 3% of electricity. And the rest of the 16% is produced by the 16% of the medium-sized dams. So if you improve, and this is what the big companies are doing, if you improve the performance of the big dams, you could get rid of thousands and thousands of small dams. But what we heard yesterday, and this is what Günther Colonia told us, is that we are turning from producers and consumers into prosumers. And wind and photovoltaics is becoming the cheapest energy available. And if we are building a dam and destroying a river, this is certainly not green energy. So we are losing something that cannot be reproduced. We can replace wind energy with gas energy. We can replace photovoltaics with other kinds of energy, but we cannot replace an ecosystem, a water ecosystem that has gone. We cannot replace it with energy.
Sure, thank you. We have one question from a participant from Zoom, and so that is to, I think, to you, Professor. So it's about the permafrost in the the permafrost melting in the third pole, and so what are the consequences, and how can we prevent these catastrophic effects of permafrost on the third pole or in other places as well? And we'll take 2 more questions, and Chuki and so we'll take 3, Chuki, Dejan, and Martin. Can we have the mic, please?
Hello. So my question is a general one. It is for the whole panel. Whoever wants to take it can take it. So in the commercial mainstream movie 2012, we see the apocalypse approaching, and all the powerful people run to the Tibetan Plateau. But from the discussion we just had, we see that it's pretty evident that the local people on the Himalayan belt will be the first one to meet with catastrophe when push comes to shove. So my question is, how then are we to negotiate with the governments in power, be it China or India, to convince them of the dangers its citizens are going to face?
Thank you. Dejan.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dejan Palmo, and I'm from Tibet Policy Institute, and one of the co-organizers of this conference. So my question is more of an open question, and I want to talk about the climate change research in Tibetan Plateau. So most of the climate change research on the Tibetan Plateau is mainly done by the Chinese scientists. So these Chinese scientists, Chinese government, they are mainly policies is mainly based on this what these Chinese scientists have found out, right? So my question is, since these Chinese scientists, they are working within the political system where they are not, they cannot speak openly or critically against the, the government, So, what can international community or, the Chinese government should do to have more, open or more transparent climate change research on the Tibetan Plateau, so that we can really understand what is really happening on the Tibetan Plateau.
Yes, excuse me. My name is Martin Bursig. I'm climate renewable energy expert, and before I raise the question, I'm also vice president of the European Renewable Energy Federation. So the issue of hydro is an issue I have to say something, and hopefully I will bring a bit of light. I think it's important so that we understand each other to distinguish between small hydropower plant and large hydropower plant. The European legislation, framework legislation, directives, they do distinguish and support small hydropower plant. With respect to the Renewable European Federation, the Federation supports small hydropower plant construction of course, that all the projects have to undergo environmental impact assessment on all the details, and in the future it should be also life cycle assessment and carbon footprint. That things which are not yet part of the environmental impact assessment procedure. But the Federation doesn't support large hydropower plants because the experience shows us that the negatives prevails the positives. So this is just to create. But my specific question is to Martin Mills. You showed these two slides with permafrost, and those were probably thermo infrared photography. What was it? How? No. Okay. So you tell me the technique. My question is, if there are any models, predictions, which tell us, if we look on a IPCC report and that scenarios, which also tells us, because I'm specifically interested in a byproduct of permafrost thawing, which is a methane release. So if there are any models which shows us a different scenario of permafrost melting and methane release. Thank you.
Can I answer that one technically, since it's a technical question?
Sure.
Okay, I'm going to quickly answer your technical question there. The permafrost degradations that are occurring across the Tibetan Plateau, there's a lot of evidence that it's a different scenario from, for example, the permafrost degradations that are occurring particularly in areas like Siberia. Siberia, we have a deep layers of fossilized material in a way that we don't have in the Tibetan Plateau. Apart from anything else, the Tibetan Plateau's permafrost does seem to be lighter, it's not as thick. You know, as I say, in Siberia, for example, in areas like Kamchatka, you know, the permafrost can be 1.5 kilometers deep and contains multiple layers of animal, plant, and human deposition, much of which is beginning to come to the surface, including, I hasten to add, a variety of interesting and unpleasant diseases that we have seen in the past. You know, anthrax, the real worry that people have is smallpox. But this, as a consequence, there does seem to be, there is some methane, which creates, of course, this sort of feedback effect, but it isn't as dramatic as the stuff we're seeing in that. So that issue seemed to be lesser across the third pole region, and that's largely as a consequence of its geological and biological history, which makes it rather different from Siberia. It's catastrophic in Siberia. It's very substantial. It's extremely problematic, and the Siberians are suffering from, you know, the really substantial permafrost loss. They're losing cities. Cities are simply falling apart because the buildings are built on ice and the ice is melting. And that is their foundations. You know, and this is really kind of catastrophic, immediate loss. I will come back to your question, by the way, which is about Tibetans and 2012, which I thought was a great film, but perhaps not a guidance for the future, apart from anything else, 2012. The long-term forecast for the Tibetan Plateau itself, and when I say long-term, I mean over the next 100 to 150 years, is that the Tibetan Plateau itself will actually grow warmer and wetter and more fertile. The immediate time frame is one in which the ice of the mountainsides and the slopes will begin to dissolve and melt, which will be very, very bad for any community that's near it. But the really long-term effect does seem to be almost to point towards the Tibetan Plateau becoming sort of, in a sense, more fertile. And there are some very deep, strange patterns that are occurring. NASA's recent GRACE FO results, for example, as we talked about in the report, was that the Tibetan Plateau is accumulating water. Within the mountain range, it is filling up like a goblet of water at a rate of between 7 and 9 gigatons a year. It's a pretty large quantity of water, but at the same time that water is going low because the permafrost is melting and it's got gravity effect. So our long-term discussions are unclear, but the short to medium terms ones are catastrophic for local communities, cities, and so forth in the Tibetan Plateau.
Thank you. Professor Roland?
Yeah, these are very interesting questions and good answers. So let me say a word on the long-term issues. And what we have learned from the Iceman, this Ötzi that has been detected now 30 years ago, is that the climate when Ötzi was living, at least in Europe, in the Alps, was even warmer than it was now. So the glaciers had gone almost completely. And so the situation is in a way comparable to that what has happened. And when we are studying paleoecology, I think we get a little bit a glance of what is going to happen again. Let me say something different to the question about the Chinese scientists studying Tibetan problems. I was in China for the first time in the late 1980s to study the Taihu, the big lake. And at that time, my feeling was and my impression was that Chinese scientists, our colleagues, have been absorbing the knowledge that has been accumulated in the USA, in Europe, in the rest of the world. But now the attitude has changed. And I think it depends on the freeing of Chinese from colonialism. I think that was the main feeling of my former Chinese students, that China was under colonial law for about 200 years. And so it's maybe even comparable to India. But now this colonialism has been overcome, and China is now again in the position it had for 2,000 years. It was the center of the world. And now the flow of knowledge maybe is going in the other way around. But what I think is that scientists, and I myself, I'm biased by my background, by my education, by my ideology, by my parents, by everything. But in the end, scientists have the basic understanding that we are relying on facts. And we should try to distinguish facts from fake and facts from ideology and science from politics and so on. So there is, I think, is hope, even if our background and our basic understanding of the world is different. Scientists can overcome this situation by looking at the fact that what is happening. And I think Chinese scientists, and I've been recently in China with the Tsinghua University, I think we have the same understanding of what is happening if the climate is changing, and the climate is changing very rapidly. So this is my hope, that at least on the scientists, there could be a basic understanding that we are dealing with facts.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll go to next Tembala and Manchi, and I will request for 2 minutes answer.
Okay. So I would answer two questions very quickly. First one about the movie 2012, which Martin already explained. But what is interesting about the movie is that Tibetan Plateau is the only remaining place in that movie. And what that suggests, that says something about a Tibetan saying. You know, I'm sure many of you might or may not have heard. There's a saying in Tibetan literature that the snows of the Tibetan Plateau are eternal snows, which when they melt, the world ends. So there's a saying, Thoma kabu lukunda, pat tau tanda, tama napo panda said. So to translate in English, it says the Tibetan Plateau would first appear as white as a sheep. Then at a certain point of time, it would appear as stripped as a tiger, which means snow would be melting, then there's land, snow, land, snow. And finally, at the end of the world, when the time is bad, the Tibetan Plateau would appear as black as a pig. So Tibetan saying, it's historically saying that the world would end when the glaciers on plateau would melt. So this is something that resonates with the movie. But so how can we can make the governments around Tibet, periphery of Tibetan Plateau aware of this? By 2035, the river flow from Tibetan Plateau, of course, it will increase until 2035. And scientific papers, they're saying that by 2035, it would peak. And beyond that, the flow of river from Tibetan Plateau would gradually decrease. That's when the conflicts will begin to arise, and that's when the government would be forced to do something. But now a question about third pole, I really like to say something about how can we avert the consequences of climate change on the Tibetan Plateau. So as Martin said, Tibetan Plateau can either become really beautiful or it can become a desertified plateau. It can go either way. There's no guarantee that it will go in one way. But fortunately, Tibetan people have always been powerful when the plateau is warmer, historically. In case of Xiangyong, case of Zhenbo, the climate was warmer historically. There's a data on that. So what happens is that with melting permafrost, melting glacier, there's more water on the plateau and increased precipitation, more. So land is more fertile. Within the next 10 or 20 years, if we are able to plant a lot of trees, if we are able to adapt to a changing situation, we can have a forested green Tibet. But if we just don't realize it or we don't understand the change, then we might be forced, there will be a superficial greenery on the plateau. The diversification of the vegetation would decrease, but there would be like long grasses that would appear, but the strength of it would be gone. So after many, many years, Tibet would be, the desert from north would gradually extend, and we might become a desertified plateau as well.
Yeah, I'll respond to the small hydro projects issue first. In case of India and in Himachal, the smaller hydro projects, whether they're 25 megawatt and below or even 5 megawatt and below, the micro, they are exempt of all environmental impact assessments. So they don't need to go through any of that. And that has been an issue that communities have been raising, especially because the small projects are being built on the smaller streams, which are directly being used by the local population for irrigation, running water mills. These are very important part of the larger riverine ecosystem. So you have the fish migration, especially of trouts and the Himalayan trout, and they come to spawn in the smaller streams because the bigger rivers are too turbid or too fast for the fish. So they come for spawning in these smaller streams. So it's impacting the riverine ecosystem as well. So there are several issues around there, and the problem of environmental concerns not being addressed. The question of how can we build pressure on governments and accountability, I think one thing I would say is definitely more international solidarity. We need solidarity across the board, and that solidarity should also be, kind of grounded in knowledge sharing, decolonizing knowledge, kind of breaking the hierarchies of knowledge, because there's a lot of knowledge within local communities, within, emerging from people's movements and civil society groups. So I think there needs to be a more balance, in terms of the conversation that's happening. And the second thing I would say is also intersectionality. I think somebody spoke about it yesterday, that we cannot isolate the climate issues. We need to look at the social, economic, political connections and have those dialogues across the board. So I think these two are important.
Thank you. I'll take last 4 questions because we have just 10 minutes. Siju.
My name is Sejidoma, and my question is for anyone here, maybe Tempala. So Tempala, you identified when you first started in this position, there were very few people doing this, and now we have a lot of young Tibetans who are doing this academically. Like, we have Dr. Lobsang La, and we've so it is a growing trend, and it is an opportunity we've never seen before. So what are resource gaps that you've identified? Lobsang La, you can answer this too, actually. In your experience, what are resource gaps within our movement that's preventing us from, or just holding us back from getting our issue to the next level, whether it's taking it on a global stage? And I know there's the geopolitical issue of China, but even with that reality, what resource gaps have you identified that could really propel our work?
Anyone else? Okay, so we have only 10 minutes, and then I have my last question to you all, and I would like to have a very, very short answer from all of you. First one, any last final comments on the issues that we discussed here. The second is that so the COP27 would happen in Egypt, and so what is your demand and what is your ask for the COP27 leaders who make policies over there? Because when we talk about Tibet third pole and we discuss how important the third pole is, right? But the reality is that when we talk about COP26, Tibetan people are not officially represented at the official COP discussion. We don't have an official discussion, so we are not part in the whole the global climate discussion, and we are not in the the whole debate, and at the official level, and from my experience, it's hard to see. I mean, I have not seen a single person talking about Tibet at the global climate discussion. But we talk about the significance of the third pole. So I mean, it's like so this is the reality. I mean, so my question is that so I mean, what's your demand in the COP27? And so I would start with Martin, and I would request each one to be very, very short and precise.
Okay, I'm going to do the roundup, and I'm going to answer that question. COP27 needs to stop thinking about green technologies. There is no, let me be really clear here, there is no such thing as a green technology. All right, hydropower plants are not a green technology. They can be bad, they can be good. Wind farms can be bad, can be good. A tree is not a green technology if, like the 3 North Shelter Belt project, you plant poplars all over North China and drop the water table by 50 meters. You have to replace an ecology with an ecology. You can't replace it with one technology. There aren't good technologies versus bad technologies. There is lack of thinking in depth about this problem versus thinking in depth about this problem. And thinking in depth about this problem is about, if we want to address these problems, we need to address them at the level of complexity. And it is simply not acceptable anymore for anyone to just kind of go, oh, well, it's hydropower. That's nice. I'll put my money there. Or, oh, well, it's trees. I'll put my... We have to think deeper at a local level, deeper at a complexity level, deeper at an ecology level, including a human ecology level. The actual requirement, the tendency to just sit there and say, oh, well, we're going to do this, and it'll all be all right. The first is, any climate scientist knows, it's not going to be all right. The second is, it will be better if we really, really put our thinking caps on and apply it. And that requires a lot of local knowledge, it requires a lot of human organization, it requires a lot of complexity. But the really important bit is, no, there's no such thing as a green technology. We have to replace ecologies with ecologies. We've destroyed one set. We have to rebuild another set, and that is complexity and diversity. Okay, so don't just sit there and kind of go, oh, well, it'll be all right because it's hydropower. It'll be all right because it's wind power. That's me done.
First, I will answer Tichu's question. Yes, it is. We are at a very fortunate and a very beautiful stage at this moment because the Tibetan Plateau is being discussed and to be written about almost every day. And if someone do really research and observe every day and monitor every day, you realize that the level of Tibetan Plateau and its recognition is definitely increasing. But then my biggest fear, as you said, is that we might be concentrating on one very popular issue that everyone wants to talk about. And in that sense, we are ignoring many other impacts. For example, we are all concentrating on rivers because it has its audience, right? It is about 10 countries that depend on Tibetan rivers. When I was working at the TBI, I started to focus. Now there are enough people doing on it. So I decided to focus on the impact of climate change to the Tibetan people in Tibet. Because the impact of climate change on Tibetan Plateau to India, there's Indian government. It's one of the richest. Many say they will do it. Bangladesh, others, they will do it. West, they will do it. But the impact of climate change to the Tibetan people, the Chinese government won't do it. So we Tibetans have the responsibility. So we have to do that. And of course, then we have to highlight about climate change and other issues as well. Now then, regarding the COP26 demand, of course, Dechana would give you, could give a more official statement. But as when I was there, I would say that the world, as we have always said, the world needs to recognize, not sympathize, recognize the ecological importance of the Tibetan Plateau. If they do it now, it is beautiful. Or else they will be compelled to do it, because at a certain point of time, 11 countries would be at a risk because of change on the plateau. And my final statement is that something that I missed in the rush to finish up is that third longest river in Asia and in the world, and the longest river in Asia, Yangtze, as it's called in China, and Dichui, as we call it, was blocked for 11 days. Fortunately, it was blocked in November 2018, beginning of winter, when the river volume of the river was at its lowest. Had it happened in summer, during the rainy season, blocking world's third longest river for 11 days. Can you believe that? 11 days. It was fully blocked, completely blocked. Inundated many villages in Tibet. Fortunately, it didn't cause a massive destruction it could have caused to the lowland Chinese provinces. So this is a clear indication of what could happen in the coming years. Tibet is very fragile. And Tibet has many rivers, and China has built a lot of dams. So landslide are inevitable. And there would be many other rivers. The 6 greatest rivers in Asia could be blocked by a landslide anytime in Tibet. And if that happens, the blockage is not risky. When that blocked, the artificial lake, when it bursts, it can wash away millions of people in Asia and other countries. So that is risky, I would say.
Wow, that's a tough one. So I would say Global North take responsibility for historical emissions, something that Liz spoke about, representation of people's movement, especially from the Global South. I would say justice, equity, and people over profits, which means we have to say no to war. We have to call out war and the military-industrial complex. And as His Holiness said yesterday, not one-eyed, but two-eyed, and the third eye needs to be open. So, yeah.
Thank you. Professor Roland?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm referring to Martin's utterance. There is no green technology, and what Manshi said about rivers, and it's right. Rivers have 4 dimensions, are connected to tributaries, are connected to spawning grounds. And the 20th century was the century when we thought we could tame the rivers. Yeah, but to upend that paradigm is also now it's quite difficult, and the 21st century must be the century where we renaturalize, restore the rivers, we give them the freedom back. One question was, where are the gaps? And I recall a call of my colleagues who said, well, we should stop doing research about climate change. We have to act. We do it to protest against. And I think that's not the right answer. We need more answer, but we need to act. And therefore, I'm very, very thankful to this panel, to the organizers, to Tibet, to focus their attention on the third pole and the importance of mountains. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. So I would like to, before I end our panel, I would like to respond to Sechu's, question about the young Tibetan researchers or environmentalists and what are the challenges or the resource gap that we faced. One, the reality is that we have majority of our Tibetans who study here in India, we don't have a specific or assigned department on Tibetan studies here in India. So there is lack of the experts, the scholars guide for the students, or we have a very limited in that. And then if we don't have a Tibetan studies in the Indian universities, so then where do we start? So that is the challenge that we are facing right now, and I really hope that people who are in power and so they would start small institutions or have a small department in any of the Indian universities or in the Dalai Lama Institute, and have a specific course on Tibetan language, Tibetan studies, environment in Tibet, and so that will also would have a more positive impact in the future. And then second challenge that we face is that because of the political reason, when we study Tibet's environment, we can't go for a field trip, right? And so the challenge is that when for me and for people like Temba Khyentse, sorry, I'm so sorry. So when we talk about, Tibet's environment, so there are like some scholars who say that, have you been to Tibet? So where is your field research? But it's not that we don't want, it's just that this is the political reality and we don't have that chance, right? But still, with these kind of problems, we still try to find ways to have a more information and to do more research on that. And thirdly, I think lack of resource, specifically the funding for specific on the subject of Tibet's environment. And if we have a more support from everyone and to have a more funding on that, so I think that would definitely encourage younger students who are in a college to do more focus on the environment side. So yeah, so that's my, I think, answer. So finally, I think I would like to end our panel discussion, and in this panel discussion, I would request everyone who has joined through online or who has joined in our room to remember the Tibetans, the Tibetan environmentalists who are in Tibet and so who are still in jail and who are still in prison for protecting the Tibet's environment or for raising the voice of the environment conservation in Tibet, and they are still in prison. And I think it's not only in Tibet. There are many people around the world who are still in a jail for protecting our planet. And I think we should really remember, and I would like to dedicate our panel for the whole environment defenders and advocates. And then I would really hope that this kind of dialogue would carry forward, and we will have a more dialogue of such issues on a future, and more collaboration, and also have create more platform or spaces for the young Tibet scholars on environment or anyone who does research on environment, and then collaboration. And so hopefully, one day at the COP26 or 27 or 28 or 29, we would have a Tibetan delegation at the UN, and then deciding our own fate and talking about our own land. Thank you.